You can see we've been taking pretty big chunks. The three pieces that are left standing there, each one of them weighs about 55 ton to 60 ton a piece. So we've been taking chunks down around the 55 to 60 ton.
You can see where they've made the cuts along right above. That's the bow tie connection. They're cutting it about 3 to 5 foot above the bow tie connection where it starts into the forming of the candlestick. They've got 3 candles left to cut. Goes accordingly, weather permitting, by midnight tonight. The last 3 candles of the northeast facade will be down to the bow tie connection.
Within seconds, the fiery concoction eats through the bonnet, spraying molten thermite into the engine beneath.
On Wednesday, April the 10th, 1912, in brilliant sunshine, although the day was cold, the unsinkable Pride of the White Star Line left Southampton.
Is thermite the new grassy knoll?
Exactly. It's the alternative story. If people don't like the regular story with 19 bad guys with box cutters doing something, it causes the building to go poof, into dust. They have this alternative, and they have friends. They have others who they can agree with, and there's comfort in that. But what's interesting about thermite, I believe it was a deliberate cover story, because if the buildings were turned into powder, every aspect of those buildings was powderized, dustified, and thermite is powdered aluminum and powdered iron rust. There's no doubt in my mind that was in the dust, because that's my point. The buildings were made out of steel frame structures with aluminum cladding. Steel is like 98-99% iron, and if that's been dissociated into nanoparticles, the nanoparticles are going to be iron that would instantly rust if it was very small particles, because we have so much surface area per mass, and powdered aluminum.
Molecular dissociation?
Yes, if you get such fine nano-sized particles. So the fact you find nano-sized dust that consists of rusted iron and aluminum oxide, it'll oxidize pretty quickly, just like iron rusting. That'll be there plentiful in plentiful quantities. And it's a good cover story, so that you don't say, what is this from? Did the building really turn to dust? Oh, it's thermite. Oh, okay. Now we have something to go at. It's very good at distracting people. It's a way of covering up what really is there. And when I first started into this and all this stuff about thermite, I hadn't researched the JFK business. Of course, it isn't the lone gunman story, but you always hear about the grassy knoll. Okay, I didn't look into it. I don't have thought one way or the other. But when I heard about the thermite, I realized, just like the grassy knoll, it's the other acceptable story. It's the official, unofficial story. And it lays everything to rest for history. It keeps the cover-up in place. And I think they're nailing the lid on that this week.
What would you say that?
This get-together in Toronto.
Okay, that's right. It's not that we want to advertise it, but, you can either spend
$39.95 for the truth, or $200 for a cover-up.
That's right.
What someone I saw posted that on the web. That plus the expense to travel there, because it costs $200 apparently for a seat for all 4 days.
Now, going back to thermite for a second, some people out there say, well, a lot of thermite reports are coming out, peer-reviewed. If they're so sure about that, Dr. Wood, have they submitted this in a Keatem case just like you did?
No, and actually, my Keatem case was a whistleblower case, so I had to be a whistleblower first. And I became a whistleblower by filing a request for correction, RFC, request for correction to NIST, telling them that their contractors were committing fraud, or allowing them to submit a fraudulent report without oversight. And they were paid by taxpayer money to determine why and how the towers collapsed, and they didn't do that.
Why not?
NIST admitted they didn't. They just brought up a hypothetical scenario, and that's what they presented. They admitted in writing to me that they did not investigate the collapse, and they felt that relieved them from having to answer the questions of why does your explanation, your analysis of the collapse not comply with the laws of conservation of momentum and conservation of energy. And they said, oh, well, does it? Because we didn't investigate the collapse. They just did a computer model of something they speculated about.
But if they're there with taxpayer money to do the investigation in the biggest event in U.S. history, in my opinion, and they're saying that we didn't investigate, please allow me to understand the logic, because I don't get it.
There isn't any. It's mind-boggling. I don't know what their excuse was for not doing it, but they led people to believe this 10,000 pages of something was an investigation of it, and it's no investigation of it. It's just, hypothetical scenarios that they were generating, and the people who calculate those hypothetical scenarios The contractors are members of what is known as the military-industrial complex. Some of them are manufacturers and developers of energy weapons.
110-story building above us, and I'm looking up at the sun.
And a split second later, I opened up my eyes, and I was just sitting there, totally numb, looking up at blue sky. Then it got dark from the smoke and everything, and I started to cough. I started to feel pain in my leg, and I said, I couldn't even believe at that point that I was alive, and I survived that, and there was nothing above me.
So I submitted my request for corrections to NIST, informing them of these errors. And about 3.5 weeks after that, the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, they just put up their website and submitted, they just started at that point, after my submission, and they submitted a request for correction also. But what was striking is that their request for correction contained no reference to any thermite evidence or molten metal, the two main things that they discuss. If they feel that it's smoking gun evidence, why would they not submit it to NIST, the government agency, and call them out on it, and then submit it to a federal KETAM case, a whistleblower case, if they have evidence of it? Are they protecting someone? Questions like that arise. But there are some reasons, either A, they felt it really wasn't important enough to mention, that they really have nothing significant, or B, they know it's a federal crime to defraud the government, or C, it's treason if done so by a government agent, because it's one government agency attacking another government agency, which is treason. So I can't think of any other possibilities. Can you?
No, I can't think. But what I can think is that you did it. If they're so sure that thermite was used and they want a new investigation, why didn't they do the same?
They have 15 engineers and architects. Can't any of them do it? I did. I was just one person.
I'm working 80 hours a week, harder than I've ever worked in my life. I'm managing a large organization of 40 volunteers with almost no funding, and I don't have time to sleep, much less file lawsuits. I don't even know how to do that.
In my earlier video entitled South Tower Smoking Guns, I pointed out a projectile near the end of the clip that moves to the right, then suddenly turns through a sharp angle and moves downward, at least from the perspective of the camera, all the while producing a trail of white smoke. For this object to radically change directions like this, it had to experience a sudden impulse. We know there was a large amount of unreacted nanothermite in the World Trade Center dust. That was confirmed in a paper published in the Chemical Physics Journal in April 2009. Thermite reactions produce aluminum oxide, which is visible as white smoke, and nanothermite is explosive. Nanothermite is stable when wet and can be literally painted onto steel beams. Nanothermite painted onto this chunk of material would explain the explosion, producing the sudden change of direction, and it would also explain the white smoke trail. When we zoom in, we can see that the path zigzags, indicating multiple small explosions. Once I found this projectile, I looked for it in other videos. I found it in several videos from different angles, but when shown against the backdrop of the white debris cloud, it is very hard to see. This is another video from a very similar perspective to the first. In this shot, the trail can be seen to persist all the way down to the bottom of the collapse. We can learn several things from the behavior of this projectile. First, it is clear that this chunk carries explosive material with sufficient power to drastically change its momentum in a short outburst. Secondly, it is clear that the smoke we see is not general smoke from the fires entrained in the wake of a moving object. Since the smoke trail follows the object in all of its twists and turns, it is clear that the smoke is being emitted from the object itself. The most obvious interpretation, of course, is we are seeing the results of nanothermite burning and undergoing explosive outbursts. Once we see this clear example of an object trailing smoke generated on its surface, we can reinterpret what we are seeing elsewhere. There are lots of chunks of falling debris trailing smoke clouds. In many cases, we can see long beams with smoke being emitted from the entire length of the beam. We no longer need to assume that this is smoke following in their wake. When we see white smoke that looks as though it's coming from the girders, it is reasonable to assume that we are in fact seeing smoke coming from material painted onto the girders themselves. When we see chunks that race ahead of the rest of the falling debris, as we see near the bottom of this view, we can reasonably interpret this as caused by explosive impulses that increase the speed of these objects, just as they change the direction of the one we've been studying. It is time to take off the blinders. We have not only chemically detected nanothermite in the World Trade Center dust, we are literally seeing nanothermite in action. Once our eyes are opened, we can see it wherever we look. Once I found this projectile, I looked for it in other videos.
Holy shit! What happened? Oh my god! Oh my god! Oh my god! The World Trade Center just fell! Oh my god! The whole World Trade Center just fell!
For this object to radically change directions like this, it had to experience a sudden impulse. Nanothermite painted onto this chunk of material would explain the explosion, producing the sudden change of direction, and it would also explain the white smoke trail. We can learn several things from the behavior of this projectile. First, it is clear that this chunk carries explosive material with sufficient power to drastically change its momentum in a short outburst. In many cases we can see long beams with smoke being emitted from the entire length of the beam. We no longer need to assume that this is smoke following in their wake. When we see white smoke that looks as though it's coming from the girders, it is reasonable to assume that we are in fact seeing smoke coming from material painted onto the girders themselves.
Are we talking Judy Wood here?
Well,
Well,
what is your view on the bathtubs and also the lack of a bigger mound of rubble after these things came down?
I think there is plenty of rubble to account for what was in the buildings. I think that's a red herring, and I don't give Judy Wood any credibility whatsoever. So that's my answer to that whole issue. So.
First, it is clear that this chunk carries explosive material with sufficient power to drastically change its momentum in a short outburst.
I think there is plenty of rubble to account for what was in the buildings. I think that's a red herring.
There's a mountain of evidence, and the nanothermite is only a very small part of it. I wouldn't hesitate to call it a scientific footnote. Really, it fits nicely, but it has no forensic value on its own. Actually, you could not take it into court alone. But if you put it into the context, everything becomes meaningful, and that's where it gets its strength. We are ending up with a collapse scenario which is completely consistent. We have a blast scenario which are completely consistent, and that's as much as you can ask from a scientific theory. There's no truth in science. There's only the best hypothesis of the day, but we have that. There's no truth in science. There's only the best hypothesis of the day, but we have that.
The great Galileo taught us that experiment is the arbitrator of competing hypotheses. This is perhaps one of the most important statements in scientific history. Experimentation gives us the ultimate truth-finding tool. It is the central thesis of the scientific method. You can apply it to virtually anything. As the modern genius Richard Feynman once said,
"If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong." And that simple statement is the key to science.
Thermite burns so incredibly hot that it can melt straight through the engine block of a car.
If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong.
When thermite reacts, it produces aluminum oxide and molten hot steel.
If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong.
It is conventionally used for welding and melting iron and steel.
If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong.
In its November 1935 issue, Popular Mechanics explained how the 3 million pound steel Skyride Tower in Chicago was demolished using thermite to melt through its 10-foot steel leg sections. Several thousand major structural components would need to be severed in exactly the right manner within fractions of a second of one another.
If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong.
So this seems to be a scientifically legitimate hypothesis. We have a chain of evidence from the crime scene leading directly to nanothermites. We have scientifically verifiable experiments providing that you can demolish steel structures using thermites. And we even have a host of shady suspects who worked inside the World Trade Center buildings with a series of suspicious connections to companies which produce nanothermite, including patents on nanothermite demolition devices. Many of the pictures used in her book and on her website indicate irregular heating, burning, and warping of various materials, which she then posits could only have been produced by an exotic and unproven mechanism.
If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong.
I would suggest that many of these characteristics are consistent with pyroclastic flow damage seen in volcanic eruptions, and could have just as easily been produced by superheated exploded steel and concrete using nanothermite. Take this picture for instance. The car is only burned on the top half. If you think about a cloud of superheated gas expanding and rolling outwards from the collapsing buildings, the gas inside the middle of the pyroclastic flow will be the hottest, but will cool down considerably on the surface of the cloud, where it is expanding and coming into contact with surrounding cooler air. As the cloud rolls outward over cars like this one, the superheated gas at the center will be hot enough to melt the paint, while the cooler periphery of the cloud as it rolls across the ground will leave the lower half of the car at a much lower temperature than the superheated gas near the middle of the cloud. So you see there are alternative explanations for all of the material characteristics of debris seen in Dr. Wood's extensive photo collections. If you think about a cloud of superheated gas expanding and rolling outwards from the collapsing buildings, the gas inside the middle of the pyroclastic flow will be the hottest, but will cool down considerably on the surface of the cloud, where it is expanding and coming into contact with surrounding cooler air. As the cloud rolls outward over cars like this one, the superheated gas at the center will be hot enough to melt the paint, I would suggest that many of these characteristics are consistent with pyroclastic flow damage seen in volcanic eruptions.
If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong.
According to Pasquale, his fall ended here, at the top of what was left of Stairway B.
I didn't feel anything. My body was totally numb. I mean, I felt nothing at all. I just opened up my eyes and saw blue sky.
If you think about a cloud of superheated gas expanding and rolling outwards from the collapsing buildings, the gas inside the middle of the pyroclastic flow will be the hottest, but will cool down considerably on the surface of the cloud, where it is expanding and coming into contact with surrounding, cooler air. As the cloud rolls outward over cars like this one, the superheated gas at the center will be hot enough to melt the paint.
Anybody coming? Which way is out? I go with you, brother. I think this is out. Go against the fence. Walk the fence. Gotcha. Hey!
If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong.
Now, the biggest problem I run into when I try to talk to physicists or anyone else about the Hutchison effect is the issue of experimental reproducibility.
Here we have a collection of samples from 1979 to 1989 of metal pieces done by the Hutchison effect apparatus. And we're going to start with the very first sample, which gained a lot of history around the world and also in a lot of national laboratories, which is this very large, heavy steel bar.
It definitely seems intuitively possible to produce these types of effects using some sort of molecular or electromagnetic interference. And with Dr. Wood's PhD background and area of expertise in materials science and interferometry, I'd like to see some experiments performed and papers published on this in order to give it more scientific credibility. All I've seen from Dr. Wood so far is a colorful picture book which continuously stresses the need to look at evidence in order to determine exactly what happened at the World Trade Center.
So your answer is no, you have not read the book, Where Did the Towers Go?
No, I have not read it. I don't own a copy. I would never buy it. I think that she's a distraction. The whole buildings were blown to Kingdom Come. I mean, that much is obvious.
So let me ask you this.
Whether you believe that was done through some space-age laser technology, which we can't prove or say exists.
Also, because of the evidence of lack of high heat, you can eliminate the explanation of some kind of thermal energy weapon as the mechanism of destruction. So that right there eliminates laser beams from space. So that right there eliminates laser beams from space.
The whole buildings were blown to Kingdom Come. I mean, that much is obvious.
So let me ask
Whether
you this.
Whether you believe that was done through some space-age laser technology, which we can't prove or say exists in any definite way. Or whether it was
Jeremy, did anybody
anybody
at any point? This is what I'm going to do. Okay, here's the deal. All right, my audience is very well aware of what neurolinguistic programming is and psyoping is, and for you to very skillfully, carefully inject certain words into people's minds, like has been done to us during the psyop for 12 years, for you to do that to my audience, I find to be reprehensible. Okay, so what I want you to do, did you ever hear me say anything about firing beams or patents or anything like that? I'm asking you questions.
This is the first paper that she co-authored with Morgan Reynolds.
Who's she? Listen to me. Focus. Look at me, dude. Seriously, look at me. Look at me and listen to me.
Right?
Look at me. Focus on me. I'm going to ask you something. The towers, 1.5 million tons of debris, okay, turned to dust in midair, okay, and that debris never hit the ground. Okay, let me. During the destruction, there was an absence of high heat. And you're saying the thermite possibly caused that. Is that correct? Witnesses reported that the initial dust cloud felt cooler.
You're saying that a laser weapon or some sort of directed.
Did I ever say laser? Did you hear me say laser at any point in time?
Well, no. This is a more scientifically accurate.
Did you hear me say you're saying laser to my listening audience? Don't go past me. Focus on me. Speak to me. I never said laser. I said during the destruction of the tower, there was an absence of high heat. Witnesses reported that the initial dust cloud felt cooler. I have a person, I could put him on the line right now. His name is Tom Hansen. He's a principal with my show. He stood at the base of the towers. He said that the waft of dust that was coming out was cool. And you're saying that that was thermite. How could thermite possibly be cool? Is there thermite that's cool?
This is what are you talking about? The thermite in the patents, which I have, these are real patents. You can look them up. They were filed by Battelle, and they had detail in those that nitrocellulose explosives are used in conjunction with the thermite incendiary. Thermite melts the steel, and the nitrocellulose explosive will literally blast it through. So you're not just talking about a thermite.
So thermite that melts steel produces a cool waft of dust going through the entire city of New York City. Is that correct? Is that what you're saying?
A controlled demolition. The buildings were blown up, man.
Okay, they were blown up. So thermite being used.
You're saying that a directed energy weapon did this? Is that what you're saying?
Did I ever say that? Did I ever say that? You're my listeners. My listeners are actually hearing you say this to me. Did I ever say that? Did you hear me say that?
No, I called it I called it a laser because that's a more accurate.
Did I ever say that at any point in time?
Any weapon you can possibly imagine, aside from chemical or biological.
Have I said weapon?
Energy directed in nature.
Have I mentioned the word weapon since I've met you?
Can I talk about some other facts?
Sure.
Which are very interesting, and I think.
Okay, so you just want to skip over and not answer any of the questions I've asked you so far. You want to tell me the thermite existed in the World Trade Center towers, and we do know that if thermite was used,
thermite was patented by people who occupied the floors that were hit on 9/11. It was patented by these people.
So if thermite
has connections to all these people, it was developed at Los Alamos National Laboratories under the direction of Marvin Bush's company. Securicom Stratesec. They helped develop this stuff at Los Alamos
That's
National
the equivalent.
Labs.
What you just said is the equivalent of Alex Jones placing documents on the internet, okay, then setting the SEO to it, and then referring everybody to Google to go Google the terms to find the documents that he placed there. So, of course, thermite was patented and all these things took place so that there would be a story, kind of like brown people in airplanes. You know, like we had to come up with a viable excuse about Saudi Arabians.
This wouldn't happen. It was either controlled demolition with people actually going inside the buildings, actually rigging these towers
facts
with
do you have?
explosives, okay?
What facts do you have that
people
a controlled
who worked inside
demolition?
Buildings, rigging the buildings with explosives. All right, or it's something else, right? Like,
did you read her everything in her key tam case?
Say that again. Key tam?
Yeah, she filed a key tam case in federal court. Did you read everything contained in that forensic investigation that was filed?
This is what I call. My.
The answer is yes or no. It's a simple one.
Psyop.
No. I asked you a question. Did you read her federal case?
Take future cases with 9/11 evidence seriously because they look at her and they're oh, this stuff.
No. But here's the thing. So we have a textbook, and then we have a forensic investigation that was filed in the federal court system. Did you read that information that was filed with the federal court system?
No, I read her papers, man.
Okay.
There's much more.
So you didn't read the book. You didn't read the book, which contains.
Psyop, man.
This is not a psyop. Okay, let the listener decide.
You.
No. Let's set Dr. Judy aside. I've read her book. I've read the forensic investigation she filed with the federal court system. You say you haven't, but you're more qualified than me. Is that correct?
I've read her scientific papers. She has no evidence for this space
excluding
weapon,
the textbook and the federal court
laser
documents.
Weapon. That's more accurate than directed.
You just said
energy
space-based weapons. It has nothing to do with anything that's in the federal
laser
court.
technology, laser time.
I sure do. Light amplification by stimulated emission of radiation.
So how much energy would be required to power a laser?
Can I ask you something?
Demolishing
Can I ask you something? I just asked you a question. If you read the textbook, if you read the forensic investigation that was filed with the federal court system, you said no, but you don't think that that's important, although it contains the investigation that everyone's been calling for. You just said, I didn't read the investigation, but that's okay.
I read her scientific papers. Why do I need to read her
excluding
court case, man?
Excluding
she's
the formal document.
I know she's a psyop.
No, what is the psyop?
Look at how many people have gotten talking about space lasers
hold on a second. Let me,
and get completely written
space
off
laser
and discredited.
beam. Sure. You sound formal document.
I know she's a psyop.
No, what is the psyop?
Look at how many people have gotten talking about space lasers
hold on a second. Let me,
and get completely written
space
off
laser
and discredited.
beam. Sure. You sound like Alex Jones. Hold on one second. Space beams. Yeah, you just keep inserting that into everyone's mind. They know what the psyop is. They're very, very well educated. Here's the thing. You ready?
Very well educated?
Yeah.
To a psyop that's taking all the attention off who put bombs in those buildings.
Although conventional explosives have been ruled out due to lack of noise and seismic evidence.
How many times did I say space beam?
I've gone through the tedious work of identifying and naming by name and all their connections and lining up for people.
All of my listeners heard you say laser, not me.
And says, oh, don't look at that. Don't look at who ran security in the buildings. Don't look at who had the contracts for electronic security. Who redesigned the electronic security system after the 1993 World Trade Center bombing.
Right.
Don't look at any of that stuff. Instead, just look at a space laser or
say everything.
That's more important.
Say everything to our listening audience except what's contained in the 500 pages that's right in front of me and the federal court case, the Ketam case, which contains the entire forensic investigation that AE 9/11 Truth has been asking for. It's already been filed. Say everything outside of that because I don't see laser here. Hold on a second. Let me go through this 500 pages and see where it says lasers or space beams. It doesn't say that. You would know that because you haven't read it.
All I know is that a space laser is a more accurate descriptive term.
Who said space laser?
Energy weapon. A directed energy weapon could be a basketball.
Who said space laser? Who said that? Who said that? Who brought that? I just want to know one simple question. What the answer to this question? Where did 3,000 toilets go? Where'd they go?
I want to know where all the debris went and why it was removed so fast. You know, I don't have the answers for these questions, man. You're going to ask me the questions? Look, fools have a million. Fools have more questions than a wise man can answer. You ever heard that saying before?
Your answer is, as a physicist, 12 years you've had to study this, you have no idea where the 3,000 toilets went. Is that correct?
They were blown to Kingdom Come along with the rest of the building.
We have visual evidence that there's extreme explosive forces at play in the Twin Towers, hurling without regard to public safety.
And a split second later, I opened up my eyes, and I was just sitting there, totally numb, looking up at blue sky. Then it got dark from the smoke and everything, and I started to cough. I started to feel pain in my leg, and I said, I couldn't even believe at that point that I was alive, and I survived that, and there was nothing above me.
a controlled demolition. The buildings were blown up, man. They were blown to kingdom come along with the rest of the building.
If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong.
Or the care of the surrounding buildings, many of which were quite destroyed. And the question is, why did they do it that way? My speculation, and it's just that, is that they didn't have access to the perimeter columns as much, perhaps. So they had to have enough explosive force to take out not only the core columns, but the floors and everything else in the building.
To a PSYOP that's taking all the attention off who put bombs in those buildings.
Although conventional explosives have been ruled out due to lack of noise and seismic evidence,
they were blown to kingdom come along with the rest of the building.
They're taught to memorize this list of talking points that are just drilled in. Like this idea about thermite. Sure, there's aluminum dust and iron dust, but what does that have to do with what happened to the buildings? I've yet to see any connection with that. And even Niels Harrit, who was the first author on that, quote, peer-reviewed thermite paper, it says that we shouldn't speculate on how it was used. None of the authors can agree on what it was used for. They don't know.
Is everyone trying to decredentialize Dr. Judy Wood?
Architects and engineers from 9/11 Truth, that you're calling them a PSYOP. You're saying that they're a distraction. Yet this one woman who wrote this book trying to convince everyone that it's space lasers that brought down the World Trade Center.
So that right there eliminates laser beams from space.
What in this book that you want to call a PSYOP that's disputable? What in this book do you want to dispute? Which part of it? I have 500 pages.
Look, I don't want to talk about that book. I want to talk about real evidence. I don't want to talk about that book. I want to talk about real evidence that will lead to convictions. Nothing in Judy Wood's book will ever put anyone who was responsible for 9/11 behind bars.
You think so?
Now, who are some of the companies that worked with NIST?
Well, there's 23 on the list. The biggest ones, the one that had the most number of people on board was, the two top ones, Applied Research Associates and SAIC, Science Applications International Corp. Those are also known as part of the military-industrial complex. And in particular, ARA, Applied Research Associates, are developers and manufacturers of energy weapons. If this case had gone forward, think of that scenario. If this case had gone forward, I get to put people under oath. Now imagine if you put those people, ARA and SAIC under oath. And, ARA in particular, they have, currently I think they still have, and they had at the time, a contract with the U.S. government to know everything about any weapon of mass destruction that is being developed or has been developed anywhere. So not only could they recognize what technology that was used, they would know whose technology it was. Wouldn't it be nice to put them under oath?
Indeed.
If this case had gone forward, that's what would happen. So I kind of think that has to do with why they dismissed it. But the judges were respectful. They didn't laugh the case off. They just, they were ignoring the law to dismiss the case.
But you know what? We were able to get through some very important questions. And I kept it, to the best of my ability, to facts and evidence with him. And quite frankly, I was kind of shocked.
The actual admission that he wasn't reviewing the evidence. Also, what I found really shocking is I didn't count how many times. I just listened to the show once, but you could go back and count. How many times did you correct him on space beams, laser beams from space, ray beams from space, that type of thing?
Oh, yeah.
About a dozen?
Oh, at least.
Maybe at least a half a dozen, if not more.
Well, he was, and I am being overly dramatic when I say he was forcefully injecting that word, and there were certain words that he was trying to put in everyone's minds. And I said, okay, what is he attempting to do here? And it's pretty consistent with the general thing. I guess they're all reading from the same script.
Right. They have a list of talking points and sound bites that they spiel off as they've memorized that they are to insert. Another thing that you didn't catch, that he almost tripped you up on, you didn't repeat it, but you didn't reject it either. But it's something that subconsciously goes into the listener's head. You were talking about the towers turning to dust in midair. He would repeat what you said with the word replaced, with dust replaced with vaporize.
Vaporize. Oh, okay.
And Stephen Jones does that, and Greg Jenkins has done that.
And lastly, we have the hypothesis championed by Dr. Judy Wood, a violent opponent of the nanothermite evidence, who instead insists that the towers were vaporized to dust. And
that's the one thing I am most pleased with myself about in that setup deal that Greg Jenkins did, that each time he replaced turn to dust with vaporize, I called him on it. As tired as I was, that was I'm proud of myself for that. He kept trying to slither it in there.
Will involve, I guess the term you use is dustification of metal, or I guess another way you could get rid of it.
Trying to invent a new word.
yeah, might as well, right?
Poof, yeah.
Or the vaporization of the metal in the towers, one or the other.
Mm-hmm.
The reason, and I even state in my book why that is not. Alien scientist tries to present that as a more scientific-y, word, but it's incorrect. It's incorrect to use a word with specific meaning and apply it to something that it does not, where it's not applicable.
Right.
The buildings were not vaporized. Vaporization implies heat. You know how you make a vapor over, steam?
Right. That's right.
High heat to vaporize metals or whatever. The building was turned to dust by a not high heat process. So vaporization is inappropriate for a term. So why this big effort to insert vaporization?
I mean, I can't believe people kept recommending her to me. Yeah. It's a joke. Her book is a joke. It's mostly padding. She thinks, She thinks that there was this beam weapon pointed at the Twin Towers that somehow vaporized the steel.
This is a slick thing because most people don't realize that difference. So if they start repeating my work saying, oh, she says it was vaporized, the person is innocent motives. They just don't realize the difference between turning to dust and vaporization. That right there, whatever they say after that, it can be refuted because vaporization is inappropriate.
Mm-hmm. Oh yes, that's
It's
right.
very slick maneuver, and I'm glad you didn't repeat it, but you didn't catch what was going on with that one. That was
Very subtle.
a really slick one that he was just slithering through there, through and through. If you go back and listen to it, it's all throughout. You know, whenever you say turn to dust, he repeated it with saying vaporized.
I know. I did point out that he was speaking out of 5 sides of his mouth, and we talked. We referred
that
to.
was true. That was true.
Yeah, he was. You know, so it's difficult to pick which words were coming out of which hole and which direction they were going. I mean, it was very. Yeah.
And there's one other one that was just kind of hilarious, is when he said a directed energy weapon could mean anything. And then he said, well, a more scientific word for it is laser. And he goes off, showing that he knows what LASER means. Mm-hmm. And so he was going to use laser. Well, that's a specific type of directed energy. Directed energy is a whole wide category. It's like kinetic energy weapons. Mm-hmm. You have bombs, you have hammers, you have wrecking balls, you have shotguns. Those are kinetic energy weapons. Building collapse. That's right. So we're talking about general categories. I haven't gotten any more specific than that general categories. You have kinetic energy, you have thermal energy, you have directed energy.
Right. Right.
And he was just citing a specific one that is not applicable because lasers work with heat. The building was not cooked to death.
That's right.
It's another thing like vaporization. He replaced the general category with a specific, and then goes to debunking his specific.
Okay.
So she claims that free energy gizmo powered the laser beam from space.
Yeah.
And which is totally incorrect. I'll say right now what the title of my book means. It shows evidence of what happened on 9/11. That evidence shows a technology was used that we haven't seen before, but that technology doesn't have to be used to destroy buildings. That same technology can be used for good and can be used to provide free energy to the world. So what technology was demonstrated on 9/11, the evidence from that is also evidence that free energy technology exists.
That's right, and I understand that. And at no point in time in this presentation, even given by all of the other, like alien scientists or anyone, they want to scare us. They want to say, these evil people, these terrible people, they're using this, that, they're blowing up buildings. Alex Jones used the term directed energy technology, Tesla, Star Wars, laser beams. Oh my God, they're going to blow it up. And look at a picture of this mounted on a military vehicle. When in fact, he could say, guess what? Free energy technology exists. It was used on 9/11. It can actually be used to free us from enslavement.
Exactly.
Right?
And what it takes is for us, and there's 2 sides of looking at the evidence. The evidence is what identifies what technology was used, not the name of it, not the serial number, not what the operator had for breakfast, but what it does. The evidence defines what technology was used. Mm-hmm. And if you learn to look at that evidence, you can identify and recognize next time when that same technology is used, and that's going to deter that from being used for evil in the future. And what it also will do is set a sort of a backdrop. If everyone knows this technology exists, people who've been trying to develop free energy technology in the secrecy of their basement and being suicided, they can now develop it in the light of day because it'll be known it's not something that needs to be suppressed anymore because everybody already knows.
Right. That's right.
If somebody cannot refute, and they can't refute any of the stuff I present in my book, right. Or in my case, even the defense in my legal case couldn't. Mm-hmm. They instead represent it distorted. So they're promoting propaganda, and then they try to refute their own propaganda, like space beams and so forth.
She thinks that there was this beam weapon pointed at the Twin Towers that somehow vaporized the steel, and the evidence that she has for it is that a few people in the World Trade Center who were stuck above the fires took off their tops.
Okay.
Yeah, so her idea is that the sweat from the tops was getting excited by the beam weapon that made the tops really hot, so they took their tops off.
Okay, right.
That's the evidence that she has.
Evidence, yeah.
and please pardon me, I am a very proud meat and potatoes layman, right? Which most of us are here on the planet. We're suffering from this free energy technology that's being used against us. We have to understand it. But when I ask a scientist, okay, alien scientist, he's a physicist who claims to be educated.
He claims to be a physicist, but he for some reason doesn't want us to know if or where he graduated.
But how could you, Dr. Judy Wood, how could you look at somebody like that and say, okay, you have debunked and you have gone after Dr. Judy Wood's information that you haven't even seen? How is that possible in the scientific community? Is that even possible?
It sort of falls under malicious defamation.
Wow, that powerful, that blatant.
Yep.
One woman who wrote this book trying to convince everyone that it's space lasers that brought down the World Trade Center.
Okay, so he's literally made a YouTube career debunking you. And it's based on what? On fabrications? He's never, and he admitted, I've never seen the Ketam case, and I've never read the book Where Did the Towers Go? And I've asked him, well, how could you debunk what you haven't seen? In so many words, didn't I? I think I did it polite enough.
Exactly. I just posted a link in the window, in the Skype window. If you might want to read the title of that article.
Okay. Yeah, I was really, really disturbed by that, and then at the same time, kind of relieved. Like, well, yes, in fact, this guy is just intending to psyop. I mean, it was pretty obvious. Reviewers, beware. Beware, you can get sued. So you think that it's just outright defamation, and yeah.
Some of the cases I've been reading about are, like somebody is just wants to get back at somebody else, so they post a bad review.
Yeah.
That is clearly incorrect. Mm-hmm. And you see some of the amounts there, $750,000.
Yeah.
The poster was charged. The buildings were not vaporized. Vaporization implies heat.
And lastly, we have the hypothesis championed by Dr. Judy Wood, a violent opponent of the nanothermite evidence, who instead insists that the towers were vaporized to dust.
The buildings were not vaporized. Vaporization implies heat.
Will involve, I guess the term you use is dustification of metal, or the vaporization of the metal in the towers, one or the other.
The buildings were not vaporized. Vaporization implies heat.
She thinks that there was this beam weapon pointed at the Twin Towers that somehow vaporized the steel.
The buildings were not vaporized. Vaporization implies heat. Also, because of the evidence of lack of high heat, you can eliminate the explanation of some kind of thermal energy weapon as the mechanism of destruction. So that right there eliminates laser beams from space.
Dr. Wood says maybe there's a beam of laser or microwave from space or something that came down and...
So that right there eliminates laser beams from space.
One of Dr. Wood's hypotheses is a space-based weapon powered by free energy, another undocumented and unproven phenomenon. Given the time windows separating each of the destruction events at the World Trade Center, these couldn't have come from a single satellite-based weapon in regular orbit, so either there's two of these massive satellites orbiting Earth, or they had one in geostationary orbit over the equator firing a beam down at a steep angle over lower Manhattan.
Debris struck those particular areas and did damage. I don't know. I mean, I can't see, what's down in there. Right. I don't think there were space rays that cut holes in those buildings.
All right, I'm definitely not sure about space rays, but all I know is it doesn't appear to be thermite.
There it is. That's the inside of Building 6. The walls are intact. The basement is intact, and nobody has a friggin' clue what could do this. I wonder what's going through his head. There's no desks, there's no chairs, no office furniture, there's no bathrooms. Everything is rusted, everything is hanging symmetrically straight down, and the floor is intact. Does it look like any big chunks of metal came down here and smashed all this in? What smashed all this in? If it got smashed in, nothing, say, or you would see it here right now. The basement's intact, the walls are intact. And so this is something, you know, I can't explain it. It's not a nuclear explosion. It's not nanothermite that done something like that. It's not an air blast over it or some kind of obvious thing. There's people everywhere. Nobody knows what happened to this. It's a big friggin' mystery. And it's certainly not explosives. It's certainly not some kind of incendiary devices. It's not some kind of kinetic energy devices. Even though you see how everything is hanging, but it's not kinetically smacked apart and blown apart. Everything is symmetrical. The tower is kind of almost spilled over, and people said that's what crushed the inside of it. But now we finally see that that certainly wasn't a factor. Nobody knows. Now look at around his feet there. You can see everything is like it's a disassociation. It never got crushed. You can see that. Look, it never got crushed. Everything is missing. All the furniture is missing. Everything. All the color is missing, all the walls and everything else, like I say. And it's just even reaching way into these places is like it all got sucked out. But where did it go? It didn't go down to the floor, because there's the floor. See that car there? The parking lot's still intact. All this never went down to the parking lot. It got broke a bit, but it never went down there. And you can see everything is missing. There's no indication these were offices, or this was an office building at any given time. And you can see where one of the towers spilled over, and people said that's what done the damage. But you can see, yeah, it spilled over, but that stuff never took out the core of a 500,000 square foot building. And I don't know what done it, but there it is. That's the inside of Building 6. The walls are intact, the basement is intact, and nobody has a friggin' clue what could do this. And that's where one of the towers kind of almost spilled over, and people said that's what crushed the inside of it. But now we finally see that that certainly wasn't a factor. Nobody knows.
See, oh, that's kind of just a different angle. And I mean, could thermite do that?
I don't know.
Gage, you just talked about thermite for 2 hours. How can you possibly not know if thermite could do that or not? Could thermite do that?
I don't know. If it were placed in all the beams in that particular area, I imagine it could.
But why not? But why not the whole? Like, I mean, Building 7 clearly gone. The tower is clearly gone. These buildings standing with weird cookie cutter holes in them.
Yeah, no, it's weird. I agree with you.
That's just more like the same kind of stuff. There's like climbing in the building. And then the cars. The cars are
Richard Gage.
something else that I...
Kareem? Kareem? Kevin's son. You're Kevin's son? Yeah. Cool. Fatma? Yeah. You're her son.
No. What goes on here is outstandingly suspicious and weird. Kareem Barrett, Professor Kevin Barrett's son, comes over and interrupts my interview with Richard Gage. Kevin Barrett is another outspoken member of 9/11 Truth, who's a former professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who allegedly lost his tenure for standing up for the issue of 9/11 Truth. The problem I have with Mr. Barrett is that he does not seem to want to go into certain issues. As well, I know that Kevin Barrett, as I have met him in the past, has raised his son to be more respectful and courteous than to interrupt an on-camera interview. My only conclusion on this matter can be that Mr. Barrett, who was within earshot of my conversation with Mr. Richard Gage, purposely sent his son over to interrupt and run interference on my interview. This, of course, being done because of the kind of information that I was bringing up.
Some of these cars, this toasted, where they're not so worked, that would be explained, I would think, by falling molten iron droplets, which is what you have. Right.
I have a friend that this very same thing, and I was trying to explain some of your work, and he was like, "No, I've heard things about
the space beams."
Not even space beams. It was all just like thermite stuff, and she was just like, I just don't buy it. It doesn't make sense. It's not.
Thermite's a welding material. It's insane to think that thermite's going to do anything to the towers. It's going to in 8 seconds. It's used mainly in welding. It's also used by the military because it melts things, to melt a gun barrel, so you don't need to collect your enemy's guns when you invade their town. Or their village. You just make all their guns useless.
Yeah.
But it's also used for burning paper. Like if you have top secret documents and the enemy is invading your camp, you just burn all your papers instantly. So that's what they use it for. But it would also look like a 4th of July sparkler, because you've seen a welding torch. You see sparks spitting out all over the place.
Everybody clamors, Dr. Wood, for a new investigation. We're not going to get it from the government, but we need an independent entity to do it, and Dr. Wood is as independent as you can be. Would you agree?
Oh, yes. It is as independent as it can be, and that is the problem. By design, they don't want it to be independent. They just want to call for an independent investigation because it sounds right. And most of the people who are members of the 9/11 Truth Movement the so-called truth movement, I think are there for good, well-meaning purposes, but they get hoodwinked and derailed, and a con job pulled on them, and they buy into it and they become invested in it, and they're taught to memorize this list of talking points that are just drilled in. Like this idea about thermite. Sure, there's aluminum dust and iron dust, but what does that have to do with what happened to the buildings? I've yet to see any connection with that. And even Niels Harrit, who was the first author on that, quote, peer-reviewed thermite paper, says that we shouldn't speculate on how it was used. None of the authors can agree on what it was used for. They don't know. So if they don't know, then you need to show a cause and effect.
And I have to put myself once again in the shoes of some of the truthers out there. Look, I was there. I was with you. I was repeating the same script for quite some time. I remember when I woke up about 9/11, I was looking for the alternative media to guide me because that was the only information that I was being exposed to. But then I was exposed to Dr. Wood. It was another perspective.
And you were open to it.
I was open to it because I'm an open-minded person by nature. I'm claustrophobic, Dr. Wood, by nature, mentally. If I feel I'm in a corner and this is what I have to learn and I'm not allowed to step outside those boundaries, I rebel. I can't. It's just the way I'm designed. That's why I discuss so many topics, because I want to be exposed to everything, because everything is interconnected.
Exactly. That's life.
Yes.
That's what I was saying about, cats and birds and so forth. It's being able to experience life. Otherwise, we're just robots if we're not living life and thinking and feeling and interacting with life.
When somebody tells you, don't look that way, well, guess what? I used to not look that way, but now I do. So I have, like I said, no problem with anybody bringing some of the other researchers to discuss what they have to say. But I have a problem when those other researchers discount people like Dr. Wood who discuss the evidence. Shouldn't we, if we want the truth and we want a new investigation, be exposed to every single perspective to come to our own conclusions? Wouldn't that be the logic, Dr. Wood?
Very much. And if the evidence is available, if you want a new investigation, but the evidence is already right before you, why do you need a new investigation? Why do you need somebody else to validate it? Do you need a government stamp of approval on it? We are the government, each and every one of us.
That's right. It's a government of the people.
Yes. And this is a independent investigation. One thing quite interesting is that this book has been out for almost a year. No one has been able to refute my book. And there's been a lot of interest in doing so. It's been irrefutable. The only thing they can do is to convince others that it is not what it is. That she talks about ray beams from outer space and, lizard monsters from outer space, something, bizarre, that sounds bizarre.
So that they don't read it. So they keep them away from reading the book. I think more than getting into your information, Dr. Wood, I think what they're doing is preventing people from opening that door. That's simple.
Exactly. Or shading their vision before they telling them what to see before they open the book.
Right. And because so-and-so who's very popular said XYZ, well, because somebody says XYZ, that means that must be true. But if you think for yourself and you're an independent thinker, folks, don't be followers. It's what I'm trying to convey to you.
Here's another analogy I have with the thermite issue. Knowing that, you should expect to find nano-sized particles of rusted iron and, oxidized aluminum in the dust. If you come upon a body in a pool of blood with a bullet hole in it, will you say that the blood must have killed the person? Because you see all this red liquid leaking out of the person?
You better find the bullet.
But look at all this red liquid that's plentiful. It must have killed him. That's what the thermite is.
Right.
He also said that you talked about ray beams from space and space beams and so on, which of course is not true. I don't know if you'd like to comment on that at all.
Right, I've never stated that. I've never said anything like that. Initially, from the very beginning, it was like, let's look at the evidence. I started out with the billiard ball example, and then I started looking at the evidence. I have all this evidence of dust, all this evidence of, toasted cars, holes. It was all about evidence, but it was evidence of some kind of energy effect. You can eliminate that through the seismic chart. It eliminates kinetic energy being the mechanism of destruction. Also, because of the evidence of lack of high heat, you can eliminate the explanation of some kind of thermal energy weapon as the mechanism of destruction. So that right there eliminates laser beams from space, because the buildings were not cooked to death, nor were they beaten to death. And now these are categories, very broad categories. And another category is directed energy. Now, within each of these categories, there's specifics, like laser beams can be considered a directed energy weapon, but it's also would be acting as a thermal energy weapon in this mechanism. Now, if you say, okay, it couldn't be a pea shooter, that's a kinetic energy weapon, so therefore it can't be any other kinetic energy weapon, that's kind of silly. It's like saying, well, it can't be a missile because a pea shooter couldn't have done it, and those are both kinetic energy weapons. Jones seemed to have been doing the same kind of thing as saying it couldn't be a laser beam from space, so therefore it can't be any type of directed energy. And that's
right.
I've never been specific as to what it was.
No, I mean, I think that the original paper that you posted, there was I think they picked on the title, didn't they, which wasn't even chosen by you, suggested by somebody else.
Well, actually, the reason why I used but I used also that title, and it's actually stated in an early interview with Jim Fetzer that it was to get attention, so that it would keep me safe. It would be out there and get attention.
Right.
But it's like people were saying that energy weapons don't exist. Well, then what do you think the Star Wars program was created for if energy weapons don't exist?
Well, that's right, and I think it's very important that I think you'd obviously realised by then that what you'd seen in the evidence wasn't like anything else that you knew about. It wasn't something that was in the public eye at all. It was something which you didn't know what it was at that time. You just knew, as you said, it knew what didn't fit any of the categories. That it wasn't bombs, it wasn't laser beams, it wasn't anything like that.
I'm not even saying that the U.S. government did it, but I'm saying that those who study energy weapons probably have a lot better idea than I do.
Secretary, can I ask you a question about some of the technology that you're developing to fight the war on terror, specifically directed energy and high-powered microwave technology? When do you envision that you can weaponize that type of technology?
Goodness, it is in, for the most part, the kinds of things you're talking about are in varying early stages. Do you have anything you'd add?
I don't think I would add much. I think they are in early stages and probably not ready for employment at this point.
In the normal order of things, when you invest in research and development and begin a developmental project, you don't have any intention or expectations that one would use it. On the other hand, the real world intervenes from time to time, and you reach in there and take something out that is still in a developmental stage, and you might use it. So your question's not answerable. It depends on what happens in the future and how well things move along the track, and whether or not someone feels it's appropriate to reach into a development stage and see if something might be useful, as was the case with the unmanned aerial vehicles.
But you sound like you're willing to experiment with it.
I think that's the point, and I think, we have, I think, from the beginning of this conflict, I think General Franks has been very open to looking at new things if there are new things available, and has been willing to put them into the fight even before they've been fully wrung out. And I think that's not referring to these two particular cases of directed energy or high-powered microwave, but sure. And we will continue to do that.
Many folks criticize me and say, well, you need to name what the weapon was. No, I don't. I I just know what I know that I know. I know what I can prove, and I don't go beyond that. I only go to where the evidence shows, and the evidence shows that you can rule out kinetic energy, you can rule out thermal energy, but you cannot rule out directed energy. And I don't need to name the serial numbers or what the operator had for breakfast and so forth, because we know that such a weapon exists because it happened.
I say to people that, we know the general nature of the weapon, but we don't know who owns it. We don't, as you say, we don't have the serial numbers. We don't really know where it was particularly. So, that's the way it is, because that's the only evidence that we've got.
We do know what evidence it produces because that evidence got produced.
Get it. Oh my goodness, what the hell?
Just pull it out of the test area over there and put some paper on in the hallway here. This used to be oh my mercy, 7 long, just under 2 inch by 2 inch solid block of iron. And this is a small sample that just sort of did some strange stuff, but not as impressive as this thing. Try and turn around and get the best light on it here. It's a bit heavy. I'll do a rotary thing here. It's still flaking off pieces of it here. Small bits are all over the place. Seems to be the outer shell. Now the different unique kind of ways this happened. There was a lot of smoke, by the way, but no, the actual sample was cold. I'm not sure if the smoke was like a dust formation coming off of it or what, but these are some of the small pieces that came off of it. There's a bunch of others over in the other section there. I should film that too, I guess.
Welcome to In Other News. I'm Jeff Brady. Today we're going to go right into an interview with John Hutchison, Canadian inventor and experimental scientist. John has been working with field effects for more than 3 decades. The effects from these experiments are the result of interference zones. That is, the result of interfering several beams or fields of varying frequencies of electromagnetic energy in a target zone. Remember when Dr. Wood described how her student who worked in audio design said that if you locate speakers a certain way, you may end up with dead zones where the sound is canceled, or other zones where glass and china could be damaged? Well, Dr. Wood references this concept as the Hutchison effect. It is in fact a collection of phenomena that John Hutchison discovered in 1979 when he was making attempts to study the longitudinal waves of Nikola Tesla, as well as the work of others, such as Thomas Townsend Brown. Dr. Wood uses the Hutchison effect in her book, Where Did the Towers Go? Evidence of Directed Free Energy Technology on 9/11, to show what types of known extraordinary effects can result from electromagnetic interference. The Hutchison effect has similarities to other known technologies. Well, some listeners may not know who you are and the work that you've done. Can you just bring listeners up to date with the work that you're doing right now and how you got involved?
Well, I replicated the work of Nikola Tesla and others a long time ago, back in the 70s, and then it was caught by some scientists who came to visit me and then promoted it to the government of the United States. And what I'm doing is levitation at a distance. as well as transmutation of common metals to impossible alloys. So I was one of the first ones on the Star Wars program, where we gave demonstrations to Colonel John Alexander and Los Alamos National Labs, then on to the Canadian government, McDonnell Douglas and many others, and I brought it to main media by a demonstration on Canadian television. So, no degrees, just an interest in engineering and building old machines and that kind of thing, really.
Fantastic. And you grew up in Canada?
Oh yeah, born in Canada, Vancouver. Lived in the mountainside of Canada, North Vancouver, and that's where I built one of my first big giant laboratories was in North Vancouver. Access to many scrapyards and surplus dealers.
And it's one of the most beautiful places.
Oh yeah, you're right in with nature.
Just go back a bit and explain the science to listeners a little bit about the creating a static field and then the interference zones from the static fields. And maybe is this a connection to what George Pigott was doing or other scientists?
I would say that, going into it is going into like producing certain RF radio waves, frequencies, and high electrostatics, creating standing columnar waves that are projected out at a great distance. It takes a lot of tuning, a lot of engineering to create these effects, and the effects are incredibly strong compared to the power input. They can take a 3-inch steel bar and turn it into a knot, basically through the jellification of the metal. And I'm only working with 110 volts, maybe 50 amperes, household current doing this stuff. And it's been well documented by many different people. These effects seem to, I feel, tap into zero-point energy. And I can relate some of the articles that were accepted by the U.S. Army Intelligence and Security Command was a report written by René Louis Vallée of France, the father of the neutron bomb, who did write up a report on what I was doing and the energy potential.
I can't believe I even have to do this, but here's this video called The Hutchison Effect, and it goes on and on about some Judy Wood garbage. Ooh, whoa, but look over here. You can even see it right there. Goddamn rope. There's a wire. They're moving around on a wire. See it? There's the wire. They edited this part of the video out on purpose. Go on to talk about Tesla coils and free energy and batteries that last forever and a lot of other feel-good propaganda for the scientifically ignorant. Judy Woods and Jim Fetzer and the rest of them that don't believe there were any planes used on 9/11, those all just holograms or fake footage or whatever.
Yeah, you're allowed to ask about planes. What do you want to ask about planes?
Plane?
Oh, right.
What I say about the planes is, what I show is the buildings turned, I like to go with what I can observe did happen. The buildings turned to dust in midair. Planes can't do that. Real planes can't do that, neither can fake planes. So the plane issue is irrelevant to what happened to the buildings.
That a giant death ray from space came.
In my research for this show, I came across numerous references accusing you of claiming that this was some sort of ray gun from outer space kind of scenario, and yet I can't find anywhere where you actually say that.
I've never said it, and when I came out with this first line of evidence, which showed the bathtub survived, the seismic impact wasn't as great, the building turned to dust. There are these cylindrical holes, these cutouts in it. There's toasted cars, and presented it in Seattle. Came back, and it was the 11th of November at Berkeley. Stephen Jones gave a talk where he talked about Judy Wood's ray beams from space and space beams.
Is that where it originated, this false story?
First time I ever heard it.
That a giant death ray from space came and melted metal.
Also, because of the evidence of lack of high heat, you can eliminate the explanation of some kind of thermal energy weapon as the mechanism of destruction.
But not wood and dustified steel, even though the columns are made of concrete. Please, people, why do you pay attention to this? That's what's wrong with our country. Stupid, gullible people. And the best is, incompetent people are unaware of their own incompetence.
Here we have a collection of samples from 1979 to 1989 of metal pieces done by the Hutchison effect apparatus. And we're going to start with the very first sample, which gained a lot of history around the world and also in a lot of national laboratories, which is this very large, heavy steel bar. As you can see here, the crumbling material here is off the end of this bar here. And actually it's a transmuted material that is unknown in the metallurgical handbooks. And this particular sample has been to Germany, in the United States, in the United States National Laboratories, also in Japan and other locations. And extremely rare material that appears to be a major transmutation. Now, getting into another sample here, we find a heavy piece of what they call extruded brass that exploded with inside itself, ripping it into this pattern here, ripping it apart. Very heavy, dense material. This is another time frame of about 1987-88. Coming to this sample here of aluminum, we find that something wanted to get outside of the metal itself. And looking at it, you can see that the pressures inside of it indeed tried to get out. And going to samples that have other samples sitting on top of them, we have here a knife that was on a sample that got itself embedded into the sample. And apparently some type of transparency perhaps did happen. This particular sample was anchored down and a machine was given to shave off the top layer of aluminum to get to this level here. This is extrusion alloy, not cast aluminium. And if you observe very carefully, there's a shadow of the knife itself embedded in the metal here on the back. So that's a stainless steel kitchen knife embedded in a piece of extruded alloy. We get to a piece of, again, extrusion with a piece of wood inside that has actually came up several times in various samples analyzed in Germany and at the national laboratories. Wood mixed in with the structure itself. We're not sure exactly on this sample how much wood, maybe a cubic inch or more inside here. And coming to other samples, we find again samples that have ripped themselves apart and rejoined, as you can see in this little sample here. And then we come to breaks that indicate actually a lot of stress, as it's a nice clean cut and looks like a bent stress. So this is broken in a fashion perhaps like that. And then on the other side of the coin we come to something that looks like it was ripped apart or turned to jelly and ripped apart and frozen in time and space. This large aluminum sample Again, extrusion alloy was once one piece and was totally formed like this after some experiments, actually seen on video. We come to more hard materials such as stainless steel that are just bent and twisted around with a lot of little pot marks and pieces falling out of it. Again, similar to the large piece of steel that I just mentioned, for being the very first sample. And this is just many samples that I do have and that other people do have that still are undergoing analysis around the world. And new theories are coming up almost weekly on what has happened here. On conventional physics, it would take terawatts of power to do this. There's no radio waves or anything that can do this. There's no electrostatic fields or lightning bolts that can do this. So in the way the theory is, keyway is made up of electromagnetic and electrostatic fields that I produce, opening a doorway into another dimension that allows any kind of amount of energy to come in and do this, to create these effects. And it must be on the order of terawatts to do this. We've had larger samples, of course, fall apart, break apart. And basically, again, it seems to come back into a circle that the universe supplies all the energy needed for mankind and also for propulsion and space travel. I don't go into mathematics at all. I visualize things and always joust, so to speak, the conventional scientists or the scientists with the mathematics by saying that intuition is a shortcut through math. I visualize this and I put it in the best words that I can find. I can actually see the atom. I can see the different interactions of the dimensions inside of an atom. And I can explain it in those terms, visualize it, and actually do it physically. But mathematically, I am a basket case when it comes to trying to understand mathematics. And I only use math in quantity. Like in electricity, I need mathematics. In electromechanical engineering, I need mathematics, just basic measurements. But when it comes to the exotic math, I'm a lost cause, so I must rely on intuition, which gives me a lot more to see and a lot more to do. I believe in doing it and making the thing in reality instead of just drawing up a lot of numbers. There's a little bit of backbiting, but there's a lot around the world, scientists, very high-powered scientists, that were involved in the old Star Wars program, talking a lot of this now. They get into the psychic aspects of it, also the physics aspect of it also. A lot of the work is coming out and released with Lawrence Livermore. Still, Los Alamos is a little tight, but it's slowly loosening up. Colonel Alexander now is into remote viewing. He's the head fellow involved in non-lethal weapon technology. He made an appearance on a program called Encounters. Ed Dames is now out of the INSCOM group, Security Command group, and now is on sightings. So there's a wave of media also coming forth, such as these programs showing what is really going on. Even ABC and NBC did a special on is remote viewing true or false, and they've got a positive situation on the 1/2-hour program. ABC, I believe, or NBC, one of the big networks in the States. So there's a lot of breakthrough in media coming slowly, but it's coming out more and more. And this will give people something to look at and think about.
John Hutchison tried to reproduce all of the effects that Tesla had talked about, or many of them, and got this weird set of data that's parallel to what we saw at the World Trade Center. Jellification, bent beams, slow bending of metals, shredded metal structures, peeling appearance, like in the cars, fusion of dissimilar materials. There's a whole list of things. But there's one that might be interesting to you. Metal luminance without heat. It looks like the metal's glowing, but without being hot. This was in Baker's Trust, which was across the street from Tower 2. That's pretty weird. How do you get it to bend like that or wrinkle up? Looks like a curling ribbon. If you get a beam to buckle, that's one mode. Here's another mode. It sure doesn't do that. Now, they cleaned it up, repaired it all, replaced the beams. After they got it repaired, deconstruction begins. Why did they repair a building? To take it apart? They decided to do that right after they did some dust studies. And when they took it apart down to the level where it was very damaged, look at these beams. They look like they've been at the bottom of the ocean for 100 years.
A lot of the truthers have said there's, evidence of molten metal, but we haven't determined that it's hot. Perhaps it's metal, perhaps it's liquid, but it's not hot. And if this thing had been digging down in and pull up something, certainly these jaws would have heated up, and from thermal conductivity, this would be hotter than 82 degrees centigrade. And above 82 degrees centigrade, there's permanent damage to these things. Mm-hmm. So how could that be very hot to have, hydraulics digging down into, something?
Mm-hmm.
There's something else going on there.
Right.
There were no reports of malfunctioning equipment and destroyed equipment because it was too hot.
We have the videotapes. The firefighters reporting molten metal like a slurry or a steel mill or a volcano. Those are quotes. Giant pools.
What about the pictures of them dragging oxygen hoses all over the steaming supposed hot metal? If it were that hot, you wouldn't dare do that, would you?
Well, we do have the infrared photos of the molten metal.
Well, again, what melted the metal? Was it heat?
That's a very good question. It's also one of the first times I've heard Alex Jones speechless.
Here's this famous USGS image that folks say is evidence that it was high heat. They claim that at point E, it was 819 degrees Fahrenheit. Water boils at 212 Fahrenheit. This guy doesn't look like a boiled chicken.
More proof of concept. What this is, I can't say how it happened, how 9/11 was done, because I wasn't there in the operating room. What I can say is how to reproduce each one of these effects. And looking at known evidence of the same kind of anomalies elsewhere. Well, here's this guy named Nikola Tesla that we don't learn much about in high school, in physics class. Incredible person with incredible imagination and outside the box for sure. Well, John Hutchison wanted to replicate some of Tesla's work. He can reproduce all of these effects. The same thing we saw on 9/11. And here's someone else who's done similar things. Talk about levitation.
Mm-hmm.
George Pigott, who just over 100 years ago, or 101 years ago, got a patent on this, back when they used to give patents for this type of thing. He has this electrostatic field he creates, and then interferes something else into it, some other kind of energy field, and suspends metal balls. Levitation in that field. I like how he sits over here in his bow tie, observing his experiment.
With his legs crossed.
He needs a lab coat. But he's got some interesting things going on here. Okay, That's interesting. Well, John Hutchison creates a static field. Used to do it with Tesla coil, but then moved to using a Van de Graaff generator, and then interferes within that static field various radio frequency signals, such as microwave, and gets these weird effects. Either something levitates, or it crumbles, or it dustifies, or fumes. And anyway, here's the case of weird fires. We've seen those pictures before. Here's John Hutchison's boat experiment. You talk about wanting to see the apparent spontaneous combustion, the weird fires.
Uh-huh.
You know when the gizmo is in operation because the water is jumping up. And then when he turns it off, the boat lights up. It's like it's the result of turning it off.
No kidding.
And remember with the World Trade Center, it was after the towers had gone poof because the dust was up blocking out the sunlight. And the various first responders would say, well, thank goodness the car in front of me just went in a spontaneous combustion because now I can see where I was.
Huh.
There's quite a few of them that talk about that. There's one gal, an EMT, whose coat caught on fire, or apparent fire.
Uh-huh.
She was a human flashlight. And she didn't suffer from burns. Nothing hit her.
Here's where the towers were, FDR Drive. That's West Broadway. I sometimes refer to it as the swamp because it kind of looked like a swamp. With all the wet paper, fire hoses on the paper and dust and junk. Only the cars there were toasted. That's the toasted car park, FDR Drive. Now some folks believe that the cars were towed there. Well, not all of them were towed there. I don't know if any were, but I know some were not. There's a first responder down here who witnessed the spontaneous combustion of these cars, and like George Stephanopoulos' friend, was trying to explain it away and thought maybe a fireball got loose from one of the towers and rolled down the street and caught the cars on fire. That was the best he could come up with. Also, what was interesting is over here on the Manhattan Bridge, there were some first responders, some EMTs driving towards the World Trade Center. They said you could feel the heat from the bridge. It was so hot from the towers. But paper over here was not burned. How could you feel heat from there? I'll bet you felt something and interpreted as heat. Some kind of energy field, because that's quite a distance away.
Now look at these jellification kind of weird things, and the two in the top are from the WTC and the two in the bottom are from John Hutchison. The same kind of curly metal and while the gizmos turn on, it's like Jello. And I make an analogy with it like the game of musical chairs. So using that same kind of idea, let's say while the music's playing, a type of music, the energy system, that all the molecules are kind of up and moving around. And the music stops playing. They've got to grab hold, and sometimes they don't grab hold in the right place or get all the way back together. But while the music's playing, the material is like Jello. It's just easy to flow and to bend without heat. It's like the molecules have let go of each other.
I found it hard to believe that it actually bent because of the size of it and how there's no cracks in the iron. It bent without almost a single crack in it. It takes thousands of degrees to bend steel like this.
Typically you'd have buckling and tearing on the tension side, but there's no buckling at all.
And architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
How dissimilar materials merge. We have interesting effects from Hurricane Andrew over here on the left, showing this 2x4 through a palm tree.
Right.
Now, explain the aerodynamics that would cause that. Or this piece of plywood, and we've all heard about the straw in trees, but we're given this kind of old wives' tale of the straw was flying so fast it stuck in the tree.
Yeah.
And this Russian guy has a nice collection of these from tornadoes. Imagine, again, go back to this analogy of the musical chairs. If while the music is playing, the tree's kind of loosely structured together, and the straw comes flying along into the tree, and then the music stops playing and it's stuck.
Right.
John Hutchison ended up with this knife in aluminum. The example I like the best is the block of wood in aluminum, which I'll show you next, I think, or a few after this. Now, here's another phenomenon I found, but I didn't know what to think of it. Instead of forcing it into any kind of cubbyhole, I just set it on the shelf and waited. And when that night I was going through John Hutchison's blog, the first time I saw something that would explain why he had this peeling effect on these car doors. These are not laminated structures. Why would you get to the split thickness of the door, the door peeling apart? This police truck over on the left side, is peeled like somebody took a cheese peeler to it.
Right.
And the bottom is John Hutchison's bar of aluminum. It's about inch and a half tall, 2.5 inches, 3 inches wide, something like that.
Yeah.
And it's just peeled up by layers.
And that was solid aluminum, and now it looks like layered.
Right, and it's extruded. It's not laminated.
Wow.
And if it's melted from heat, you don't have sharp edges on it like you have here.
Right.
There's something else going on there. There's one of these samples he had sent to, I think it was University of Texas, Metallurgy Department, Materials Department, and they had no idea how it was made or how they could possibly reproduce something like that. And then we have, here's the aluminum block. Now, he has that plywood platform, and he had a piece of aluminum on it, and after he was done playing around, he realized the aluminum was stuck to the wood and chopped it out, and then somebody ground it down, and you can see that the wood is right, abruptly fused to the aluminum. Jeez. If aluminum is hot enough to melt, it's going to be burning up that wood.
Yes.
So how do you explain that? The two at the top are from the World Trade Center.
Mm-hmm.
The top left image is the only remaining file cabinet that belonged to Ben & Jerry's, and it had dollar bills in it, $20 bills in it that the police were able to return to the owners of the Ben & Jerry's store. And even colored folder dividers in it that weren't burned. So it's not heat that did that. And it's a clump of coins in the top right picture. It looks like a stack of pennies there. Zinc melts at a pretty low temperature, and well before copper. It even boils before copper even melts. So you kind of expect there to be some explosions or something if this was all melted together, because zinc is one of the lowest melting things. And you get it looks like a nickel or something in there. You get all different kind of coins, but that is not melted together from heat. A lot of people assume that and use that as proof of that, but if you start looking at it and thinking at it carefully, there's something else going on there.
Oh, yeah.
The mechanism matters. And what John Hutchison seems to have done is figured out how to unlock a key to this other source of energy. Think of also stacking up a bunch of dominoes, and you want to get them all on the ground, so you go one by one and turn them over and lay them on their sides. Or you get a needle on the end of a thread, just tap the first one, and they all go down.
Right. All at the same time.
And let's say John Hutchison has figured out how to unlock the key to that needle on a thread that can tap the first one.
Wow.
Yeah. And so it's figure out how these things interact. And we could also look at natural forms of this. So let's go to the next slide here. Yeah, remember something about a hurricane?
One funny thing I think of if only a hurricane had come on 9/11.
You missed that one. This was on 9/11. There's the hurricane you wished for. There's New York, right off the end of Long Island. Cape Cod, it was actually raining that day. That hurricane was the longest-lived hurricane of the season, the first major hurricane of the season. Started out at the end of August. Came up this way, and the 4 days leading up to 9/11, it went in a straight line to New York City. 8 o'clock in the morning, it pulled up to a chalk line, stopped, and turned around that afternoon and started heading out of town. On 9/11, the 3 major airports surrounding Manhattan reported thunder. In JFK Airport, LaGuardia Airport, and Newark airports. So we know that hurricane was close enough to cause a static field around it. Here's what was shown on these four networks about 10 minutes to 15 minutes before the North Tower got its hole, before the first event of the day. So there's no reason to not have business as usual. I drew in these red arrows pointing out the lightning all around the perimeter of the country. Because there's this high pressure system, and all around the edge of that you had an electrical storm going on. But here's what should have been shown. And a weatherman that I know, Scott Stevens, said, like, how much effort does it take to put an icon on the map? Here. This is the approximate size of the hurricane and the location at that moment. In full view, it's right against the coast. Let's look at the Earth's magnetic field. Oops. Several days before 9/11, it was kind of uneventful. Now, this was recorded in Alaska, ground-based magnetometers at 6 different locations. I also looked at satellite magnetometers. That was uneventful until about a day later, until a day after 9/11. So there was no space storms, the sun didn't have any coronal mass ejections or anything like that in this time period. These vertical lines are when each of the major events happened on 9/11. WTC-1 first gets its hole, and then WTC-2 gets its hole. WTC-2 goes poof, 1 goes poof, and Building 7 goes poof. But the key thing here is approaching this. Notice about 20 minutes before the North Tower gets its hole, the magnetic field starts to shift downward. As soon as it gets its hole, it starts back upward. And as soon as the second tower gets its hole, it goes horizontal again. But it starts going downhill, really goes downhill after Tower 2 goes away, and then when Tower 1 goes poof, it really drops off. It's haywire all afternoon. Until Building 7 goes poof. Just coincidence, right? So here's the magnetometer readings. Here's the weather reported at JFK Airport. Notice the humidity goes down in a linear pattern. This is the pressure, air pressure at JFK Airport. Notice it was going up because we had the high pressure system moving in. At the same time, the hurricane was moving in from the other direction. And guess when they met? 10 a.m. on the morning of 9/11.
As we went over Maine, we could see New York City and the smoke from the fires. Our prayers and thoughts go out to all the people there and everywhere else. Here I'm looking up and down the East Coast to see if I can see anything else.
Yeah, remember something about a hurricane? Well, what is a hurricane?
A Tesla coil.
It's like a supersized Tesla coil.
Mm-hmm.
I'll be darned.
Guess what it produces? A static field around it.
Oh, no kidding. Mm-hmm.
And the 3 major airports around Manhattan on 9/11 reported thunder. JFK, LaGuardia, and Newark airports, all around Manhattan, reported thunder that day.
Even on a clear blue day.
Right, because you know how ahead of a hurricane or storm you get dry thunder?
Mm-hmm.
You have a charged static field in the air. Remember this past spring, I think it was April 3rd, there were these flying trucks in Texas.
You told me about those, yeah.
It was a whole bunch of tornadoes around the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And they had flying trucks. It looked like they're a couple hundred feet off the ground, gauging by the length of the truck. And I've got a couple of videos here that from that. And notice that these trucks seem to be under some sort of levitation or anti-gravity. And you don't have much of anything else other than the trucks. And see what other similarities when we watch this.
These right now, these tractor trailers we're going to show you, they look like Tonka trucks being thrown through the air right there, and then they piled up. There it is right there, right after the massive twisters. They were just flying through the air and twirling.
And entire neighborhoods were torn up. We have the roof ripped off from a home. The entire bedroom looks intact with a flat screen TV still there. Another home there, 2x4s shooting through the walls like missiles. So much of the destruction caught on tape as it happened around 1 p.m. Dallas
And again,
time.
those were deadly weapons, but no one was killed.
We've got complete coverage of the storm.
As it went across a transport company, trees flying through the air, the trailers, there you go, a couple of semi, look at that, the beds of the trailers hurling, twirling around in the sky and then dropping down from at least 50 feet high down into the ground. We saw trees, there goes another semi.
And it's spinning.
It's spinning, down it comes, bang, lands on its nose right down at the ground. Big piece of a tree there that just got hurled up, I believe it was. So certainly we have seen a destructive tornado on the south side of Dallas, still within parts of the area near south of Grapevine, north of Arlington, a possible tornado in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex area, as well as over on the east side of Dallas, in toward the area around the Mesquite area, just to the west of Mesquite and east of...
And actually, there's another video of that same house from Texas. There's a video from the other direction where you can see the bookcases look undisturbed. They're against the wall that was closer to us on this one. And it looked like a stack of papers there. Nothing was ruffled. That's not wind that does that. There's something else that does that.
Amazing.
Now, we saw a lot of trucks flying around here. What else do you see in common with that, with 9/11? Cars are up on rubber tires. Trucks are on rubber tires. Trucks aren't grounded, or they can't discharge as quickly.
All right.
How about trailer parks that often are known to get nailed by tornadoes?
Right, they're not properly grounded. Mm-hmm.
Right. I wonder if somebody really, super grounded their trailer, if that would be less likely to get nailed. You know, sometimes tornadoes will skip a house. I wonder if that's why.
Right. Interesting.
Also, there's evidence of levitation on 9/11.
Working down, I was across the street, and I picked up the camera just out of habit. And something in the back of my mind said, run, run, run. And never in 20 years of shooting in New York have I run from an assignment. But something in the back of my head just said, run. And as I hit the corner of Liberty Street, it was almost being picked up by a tornado. Almost being picked up
like a wave.
It was like being picked up.
With the black cloud.
That black cloud had substance. It was like night, but it had a solid feel to it. It was like gravel, hot gravel, and just picked me up and tossed me about a block. At one second I was running, and the next second I was airborne. And I lost my glasses, I lost my cell phone, I lost my pager, but managed to hold on to both cameras.
But it threw you for a block?
I was back down at Ground Zero last week and walked the area where I have a pretty good recollection of where I was and where I wound up, and it was just under a city block.
Someone else also talking about levitation.
And there was this blast of warm air. It wasn't hot. It was warm. And it picked me up and threw me up against the wall of the building that was...
You were picked up off the ground?
Physically picked up off the ground.
There was also a first responder who was levitated and floated down the stairs. She didn't know how that could happen, so she thought that she must have died and had God carry her down the stairs. Because how else could she float down the stairs?
This huge, incredible force of wind and debris actually came up the stairs.
That feeling of just riding the air.
Very, very fierce wind, and my helmet started lifting me up off the ground.
We go up to the 105th floor and look over, and you have all these people hanging out the windows here.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to look at this one guy in particular. Right above that gash is where he is. You don't have a lot of fumes coming out their windows. And you look, and you got a guy without a shirt on and somebody without pants on, and hey, they've taken their clothes off.
Mm-hmm.
And then you see this guy here who appears to be hanging from a hand and a foot out of the building from the 105th floor, taking his pants off. Now, why is it so important to take his pants off, and why outside the building?
Right.
And put yourself there. If you heard the building was on fire, what would you do? I'd run to the bathroom. I'd get myself wet before I lost water pressure,
Mm-hmm.
and I'd be wet. If the sprinklers came on, I'd be wet. If the sprinklers didn't come on, it was hot, I'd be sweating and I'd be wet. So it seems to be a good chance that these guys are wet.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's certain energy fields that affect water differently than something that's dry.
Right.
Think of your microwave oven. You can put a paper towel in there that's dry, nothing much happens to it. If you put a paper towel in that's wet, it cooks.
Right.
And the active denial system that they use for crowd control, that zaps microwaves at a crowd,
Yeah.
they say if your clothing is wet, it's hundreds of times worse. And people just want to get out of the way of it. So if that's the case, that would be, if not necessarily that there's microwave in there, but if there's some sort of energy field in there, it could be affecting their clothes because their clothes might be wet.
Right.
It could be affecting those differently, and why they would feel it so necessary to take their pants off outside the building. And they obviously want to live because they're still hanging on.
Right. Right.
And if there's smoke or something like that inside, firefighters don't fight fires in the nude, so clothing is what you want to keep on in the case of fire. But let's say for whatever reason he wants to take his pants off. Why not just take a big deep breath? If there's smoke inside, step in, take the pants off, and step back out. Why take the pants off outside the building? The firefighters, and they had never seen people jumping from a fire except maybe once in their entire 20-year career had they seen anybody jump from a building.
Wow.
Why would somebody, jump to a certain death?
Right.
And not just hang on and, wait for, at least have a chance.
Not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, hundreds of them, correct?
Right.
Yeah.
As the firefighters, gave various estimations, but somewhere around 3 to 4 people per face of Tower 1 per minute. So let's take the lower number. Let's say 3 people per minute from each face. There's 4 faces, so 3 times 4 is 12. So that's 12 people per minute coming out of the building.
Oh my goodness.
For 100 minutes, that's 1,200 people.
And from that point, they had not even a clue that the buildings were going to disappear.
Right.
So they had no reason to think that they were in any kind of imminent danger, at that point.
Right. Like the EMT on the bridge. You said you could feel the heat from the bridge.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
That's right.
So something people perceive as heat
Right.
may not necessarily be conventional heat.
Radiation of
Melissa
some.
Doy, who was that famous one that was called 911 and said, "Help! I'm burning up! It's really hot! Nobody can breathe. Everyone's choking. I can't breathe. The air is supposed to." Not once did you hear her cough. And at first I thought this was fake, but I thought, no, wait a minute, it can't be fake due to some various other reasons. So I put it aside until it finally clicked. This person thought they're hot, thought they're burning up. And, when you're in a hot tub, there's a limit to how long they let you stay in there.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Because after a certain point, your muscles do not function. You can't get yourself out.
Wow.
And so if somebody's really hot, they might be talking like that. Not, it's really hot, I'm really burning up, nobody can breathe. She was hyperactive and no slurred speech. There was something else affecting her other than conventional heat.
She felt some sort of radiation, right?
Some sort of energy field that felt like heat.
Right. Gave the sensation of heat.
Right. And it gave the sensation that she couldn't breathe, but she wasn't choking or coughing any time during this 5-minute thing. And 5 minutes is a long time to be going on with this. That in itself was long enough time for her to be cooked.
And she's sitting in the fuming.
Or in those floors, I think it was the 86th floor or something around there.
Mm-hmm.
But at first listening to it, you have to realize it's like seeing glowing things sitting on a piece of paper. That something else is going on here. Like hot people are lethargic. They're not, if they're overcooked, and they cannot get out of a hot tub or get out of the sauna if they're overheated.
We had someone in the chat say, Ruckus actually said, if I perceive heat, I say it's hot.
Right. So she's perceiving something, whether it's conventional heat or something else. It's something is painful to her.
Mm-hmm. It's a sensation, right?
Right. It's a sensation like the EMT on the bridge. She could feel some sort of sensation from there. And we know that can't be conventional heat that she was sensing from the bridge.
It's not burning. It's not going to burn you.
Right. It's not. Well, it's not a conventional fire, but it's something else going on. And there's also various testimonies of the building coming apart and people coming apart up there. It's a pretty horrible, awful thing. And it was this fellow that I'm pointing to in the upper left corner, taking his pants off, that I sort of, felt dedicated to, because somebody's got to tell his story, what he was experiencing. He's so giving us so much information there, and it's almost to waste a life by ignoring it. These guys would want us to know what happened and to tell their story.
Oh, they would.
And that once I realized that, it was so much more easy to look at the images. Because, I'm their spokesman. That's how I felt. I made them a promise. So I don't say that the Hutchison effect did this. I don't say that. I'm just saying here's a known proof of concept that of something we know that can do that same thing.
Yeah.
At tritium. Kind of interesting. It's usually something that comes from nuclear reactions, but here we don't find any of the ionizing radiation that you get with nuclear reactions. Some aluminum with holes in it. Material is changing. This was a sample of dust from the Bankers Trust, that one they decided to take down. Look at all this zinc, the before and after. Like 3,500 times as much zinc from the control sample. Now we're going to look at John Hutchison's sample. He's got, let's just look at the relative amounts. You have a lot of copper and much less zinc. This is for brass. In the affected region, you have about equal amounts of zinc and copper. Zinc boils before copper even melts. So we don't have less copper because of heat, because the zinc would be the first to go. What's going on here? Now let's look at some of the samples that were collected from the WTC. You have a variety of all sorts of strange things in the air. And if you look at the melting or the boiling temperatures of these things, there's no rhyme nor reason to the amount of the quantity. It isn't that the things that boil at a lower temperature are more prevalent. What is even more bizarre is that organic material was also found with this, which shows it was not from a high temperature process. Now we get to the most exciting slide. This is from leaky nuke plants, what they pollute into the waterways. The amount of tritium, this is exponential, logarithmic actually, and it's a very high number. This is what is produced in the cell with cold fusion. This is what was found in the basement of WTC-6, the one with all the cylindrical cutouts in it. And this is normal background. What I use the Great Lakes for normal background. And this is from atmospheric nuclear bomb testing. You can see over time it's decreased. So it's gotten down there pretty far, but this is definitely above normal. Now, a lot of folks say, well, a nuke was used on 9/11. Well, do you think they could have kept Chernobyl a secret? People all the way around the world measured the fallout from that. If there was some kind of a regular nuke used in Manhattan on 9/11, do you think they could have kept that a secret? People all around the world would have measured it. There was no Geiger counter measurable radiation that came from there. Here are some relative numbers. If compared to what was measured at the World Trade Center in terms of tritium, the background levels are 1/50th. What was measured with cold fusion is 50 times that, but that was in a cell. Keep in mind, the World Trade Center had fire hoses on it. The hurricane rained on it. It was diluted down somewhat. Leaky nuclear plants have 18,000 times that. What was measured at the World Trade Center was definitely above background levels, 50 times background levels. There was tritium there. Now, why?
But what I want to play now is a couple of clips in relation to cold fusion, which features Stephen E. Jones.
What else? And then I did postdoctoral work at Cornell and Los Alamos National Lab. So I've been around the block a few times. I have a publication in Scientific American with a dear friend of mine, Johann Rafelsky. That was back in 1987, July. You want to look that up? The title of our article was Cold Nuclear Fusion. Yes, that's correct. We're talking there about muon catalyzed fusion. It was just a lot of fun. For a number of years, I was the principal investigator for the Department of Energy on this study of muon catalyzed fusion.
Amazing. So you've headed up investigations for the government before.
Yeah.
And now
Department of Energy funded our research. That's right.
Is it a shortcut to fusion energy? I don't want to disappoint anyone. I think I'll read my lips answer here. and then I'll carry on. I think that'll become clear why I'm saying that. Can you read my lips on that back in the back? It says no. Energy is a long way off. That's why I say no. This is our result. Just way off. It's I think a door that's open to us, but really a door on physics more than on energy. Geophysics in particular could be an interesting area.
I didn't realize that you were at the helm of this right from the beginning.
Well, at the helm of the cold fusion part of it. In fact, that was the title Paul Palmer and I gave to what we were doing, which is, we sometimes called it metal catalyzed fusion because the fusion occurs in metals. What they found is, I think, very interesting. So as I pointed out to, especially to Fleischmann, I said, look, you can't call this fusion if you don't have the nuclear products commensurate, the same level, to go with your heat. And heat means a lot of fusion, if it's fusion. Well, by now, there's still a lot of workers in this field, including myself, really. But what I've said from the beginning was, it does not look like fusion. You should not call it fusion. Now, the conference next month, July, was at the University of Missouri, and I'll be there. But the conference is titled Anomalous Heat Effects. I like that much better. Anomalous heat effects, you see. Not heat due to fusion. Okay, it doesn't say that anywhere in their conference write-up. Rather, it's anomalous. We don't know what it is. And that's what I tried to... And even Fleischmann, shortly before he passed away, rest his soul, did admit that, it was a mistake that he had made to call it fusion way back in, it was 1989. They had their press conference.
Okay, so there we heard Stephen E. Jones explaining his role in cold fusion, which is, in essence, it's an energy phenomenon. And the problem for the powers that be, the folks that are managing everything and creating our reality, is that cold fusion appears to demonstrate an effect where, under certain conditions which are still rather poorly understood, more energy can be obtained from the experimental apparatus than is put into it. In other words, at certain times, energy seems to come from nowhere, and there appear to be nuclear products which only are produced in a nuclear reaction. Now, Jones falsely stated in that clip that Martin Fleischmann, who was one of the co-discoverers of the cold fusion process, as it became called, he falsely described that Fleischmann decided that it was a bad idea to call it fusion shortly before he died. And in fact, Fleischmann, that wasn't the case. About a year after they first published their results in 1989, they thought that the idea of fusion was incorrect. They just thought it was a nuclear effect of some kind, but not necessarily fusion. And you'll hear Fleischmann quoted on that shortly. So again, Jones is creating an illusion about what's been said about the cold fusion process, and he actually contradicts himself, because he said he named the process cold fusion, but then he said that Fleischmann couldn't call it fusion. But it was actually Jones that helped to put this terminology in place. And that was also part of the information management around the whole operation, which still persists to this day, as we'll hear. And in fact, what happened to Pons and Fleischmann is, because they came up with this concept that you could get energy from nowhere, they were attacked, they were vilified, they were called all kinds of things, and you can read about that in Dr. Eugene Mallard's book, Fire from Ice.
A few people realize that what I talk about is just the evidence.
Yes.
And only the evidence. And what turns people off on looking at my work is all these rumors of ray beams from space or space beams, which I don't ever talk about.
Yeah.
And a lot of the people at the energy conference had probably heard that and were turned off of my work.
Oh,
but
right, even at the conference, even with those...
And they listened to my presentation, and they turned them around 180 degrees.
Oh, great.
They realized that, wait a minute, and they saw the connection with the energy conference, and it was wonderful. It was a wonderful conference, wonderful opportunity to turn this around, reverse it. But what's also interesting is in 2009, Pons and Fleischman were vindicated by this 60 Minutes
right.
show where,
yes.
it is indeed a real phenomenon.
Yeah.
And Fleischman was asked if he regretted anything. And he said, yes, I regret allowing my colleagues, or my competitor, to call this cold fusion. It's a low-energy nuclear reaction.
Right.
It was called cold fusion in the same way that my work is called space beams.
Oh, okay, I see.
And it was by the same person.
Right.
It was called cold fusion in the same way that my work is called space beams.
Oh, okay, I see.
And it was by the same person.
So, in other words, when you give something a certain name, that's part of the perception management process.
Yes, indeed, because that gets fixed and locked in, and it takes quite a bit to change that, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Because they were assuming that Bacchus was, spiking his sample because it didn't have the ionizing radiation that high temperature fusion has.
Yes.
Because it's not that type of fusion. It's a different process.
Well, and also, and then we'll come off that topic, the hot fusion, gang, I mean, they draw in gazillions of dollars and pounds, gazillions, in their research. And I don't think the other energy really does.
I like what you said about Fukushima.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that people like Stephen E. Jones, if you go and look at the evidence of what he's trying to do with this data and this evidence, if you look at what he's actually done, he has essentially set back cold fusion phenomena research or low energy nuclear reactions research by 20 years.
Yes.
And then if you listen to Pons and Fleischman, by the end of the 1990s, they had sustained reactions going on in their experimental setup. They were funded by Toyota. I think they got their funding pulled.
Yeah.
So I blame people like Stephen E. Jones for what happened at Fukushima, because there is no need for us to be using that technology, and many other people have said this.
I agree,
I think
absolutely.
if you couple together what Dr. Wood has unfolded in the study of the World Trade Center destruction, you can see the energy phenomena is real, you can clearly see that it's linked to cold fusion, and you can see the players that are involved. And so somebody has got that knowledge, somebody has engineered that physics, because what happened.
Yes.
That's not a theory. What happened.
And Nikola Tesla was afraid he wanted to give free energy to the world, but he was afraid it would be used for evil purposes.
Yes. Yeah.
Been there, done that.
Yes.
You don't have that risk anymore. It's already been done. Until now, those who developed free energy technology in the secrecy of their basement have wound up suicided.
Yeah.
The beauty of, if there's any silver lining in this cloud from 9/11, is it was a demonstration to the entire planet that free energy technology exists. Think about it.
Yeah.
Now people can develop it in the light of day.
Yeah.
As long as people are aware of that. Until now, folks have had to take some blind faith leap that, oh yeah, I think that person does whatever, or go to somebody's lab and witness this. But with 9/11, the entire planet can know that free energy technology exists.
It's just that we don't know that's what it was.
Right. We've been told, collapse, pile, terrorists.
Pancakes.
Yeah,
where's the syrup?
Right. And it's like people learn with flashcards.
Yes.
Instead of with just their eyes.
Yeah, indeed.